Hello and welcome to Mythos and Logos. They were born as nurses and died as admirals. They began by washing the feet of dying pilgrims and ended by commanding the most sophisticated naval force in the Mediterranean. For 900 years, they bore a white cross that meant mercy to the sick and terror to pirates. The Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, known to history as the Knights Hospitaller, represent one of history's most remarkable transformations. Not a single metamorphosis, but a continuous evolution that adapted to each century's needs while maintaining an unbroken thread, stretching back to Jerusalem's dusty streets in the 11th century. Tonight, we will trace this extraordinary journey from a small pilgrim hospice to a sovereign maritime empire, from medieval Jerusalem to modern Rome, following the black-robed knights who called their patients "Our Lords the Sick," while simultaneously developing the most advanced military architecture in Christendom. We will stand in the Great Ward of Jerusalem's hospital, where 2,000 patients lay in beds that Muslim and Christian chroniclers alike considered miraculous in their comfort. We will walk the ramparts of Rhodes as Ottoman cannons thunder against walls that seem to grow from the living rock. We will witness the 50,000 cannonballs that fell on Malta during the siege that determined whether Europe would remain Christian or become Ottoman. And we will discover how an order that lost everything, its homeland, its purpose, its very reason for existence, managed to reinvent itself for the modern age while maintaining traditions nearly a millennium old. May I ask for your help? Liking and subscribing takes just a moment, but makes a huge difference for the channel. I'm grateful for your consideration. I'm also always amazed by our international reach, so I'd appreciate hearing where you're joining from and your local time. Feel time's current reversing, pulling you gently into Jerusalem, 1023 AD, where the scent of frankincense mingles with the sharper smell of human suffering, where Latin prayers rise above the moans of fevered pilgrims, and where a small group of merchants from Amalfi are about to plant a seed that will grow into one of history's most powerful military orders. Before the black robes, Gerard's vision, in the shadow of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, before the Crusaders ever dreamed of taking Jerusalem, a peculiar institution already flourished in the Muslim-controlled city. The year was 1023, and Blessed Gerard, whose origins remain disputed between Amalfi and Provence, managed what should have been impossible, a Christian hospital operating freely in the heart of Islamic Jerusalem. The Fatimid caliphs, in their remarkable tolerance, had permitted this anomaly. Recognizing perhaps that mercy transcends the boundaries of faith, Gerard was no warrior. Contemporary accounts describe a man of middle years, soft-spoken, whose hands knew the texture of bandages better than sword hilts. He had arrived in Jerusalem as part of a merchant convoy, but something in the city's suffering held him. The hospital he inherited from the Amalfi merchants was modest, perhaps 30 beds, sustained by donations from Italian maritime republics, whose commercial interests in the Holy Land required healthy pilgrims to maintain the flow of sacred tourism. But Gerard saw differently. Where others saw a hospice, he envisioned something revolutionary, an institution that would serve anyone, regardless of faith or nation. The rule he established was radical for its time. Muslims and Jews would receive the same care as Christians. The sick would be treated as nobility, literally addressed as lord or lady, served their meals on silver plates, while the brothers who tended them ate from common pewter. This inversion of social hierarchy was deliberate and profound. In Gerard's hospital, a peasant with fever held higher rank than a healthy knight. The hospital's early records, preserved in fragmentary form in the archives of the Vatican, reveal an operation of surprising sophistication. Physicians, many of them Arabic, speaking Christians and Jews, who had studied in Cairo's great medical schools, conducted rounds twice daily. Each patient received their own bed, a luxury almost unknown in medieval Europe, where even nobles might share sleeping spaces. Clean linen, changed regularly, fought the infections that killed more pilgrims than any Saracen sword. Diet was carefully regulated, with specific foods prescribed for different ailments. Wine mixed with herbs for fever, broth of chicken for the weak, pomegranates for diseases of the blood. The funding came from everywhere and nowhere. Merchant princes in Venice and Genoa competed to endow beds. Norman nobles in Sicily, growing rich from grain exports, sent shiploads of wheat. Even Muslim merchants, impressed by the hospital's impartial mercy, contributed quietly, understanding that trade routes functioned better when pilgrims survived their journeys. Gerard cultivated these relationships with the skill of a master diplomat, writing letters in Greek, Arabic, and Latin, maintaining a careful neutrality that let his hospital survive the volatile politics of a city sacred to three faiths. By 1099, when the Crusader armies appeared on the horizon, Gerard's hospital had grown to accommodate 300 patients. The brothers who served there, not yet knights, not yet military, had developed a unique identity. They wore simple black robes, marked with a white cross, not yet the 8-pointed star that would become famous, but a plain cross symbolizing their service to the suffering. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but their fourth vow was unique: to serve our lords the sick, as they would serve Christ himself. You stand in the hospital of Street John. You are a pilgrim from Normandy. Your fever has broken after 3 days of delirium, and consciousness returns slowly like dawn through shuttered windows. The first sensation is coolness, blessed coolness after the furnace of fever. Your hand moves across smooth linen, cleaner than anything you've touched since leaving home 8 months ago. The air carries unfamiliar scents, not the expected stench of sickness and death that marks every hospital you've known, but something else entirely. Lavender, rosemary, the sharp, clean smell of vinegar used to wash the floors. Your eyes adjust to reveal a vast hall, its vaulted ceiling rising 40 feet above your bed. Windows set high in the walls flood the space with Jerusalem's particular light, golden and dense, with dust motes that dance like tiny angels. The beds, you count them in wonder, stretch in ordered rows, each with its own small table bearing a pottery cup and a cloth. You've never seen such space given to the sick. In Paris, the Hotel Dieu packs 6 patients to a bed. Here, you lie alone on a mattress that seems filled with clouds. A figure approaches, black-robed, moving with practiced quiet between the beds. You expect roughness, the casual disregard that marks those who tend the dying poor. Instead, gentle hands check your forehead, lift your wrist to feel the pulse. The brother speaks, his accent marking him as Italian, asking in broken French about your comfort. When you croak a request for water, he doesn't point to a common bucket, but produces a silver cup, actual silver, filling it from a ewer of similar metal. The water is cool, flavoured with something that might be mint. And as you drink, you notice the cup bears an inscription: "Drink, beloved of God." The morning routine begins around you. Brothers move through the ward in pairs, one carrying fresh linen, another with basins of heated water. Each patient receives individual attention. Beards are trimmed, hair is combed, and faces are washed with a gentleness you haven't experienced since childhood. The physician arrives, a learned man whose robes suggest Byzantine training, accompanied by 2 assistants who record his observations on wax tablets. He examines your tongue, checks the colour of your urine held up to the light in a clear glass vessel, questions you about your dreams. His prescription, translated by the Italian brother, includes continued rest, a diet of chicken broth advancing to solid food as strength returns, and twice daily doses of a tonic that tastes of honey and herbs. The noon meal arrives on silver plates, just as you'd heard but never believed. Soft bread, still warm from the ovens, a portion of stewed fowl that actually contains substantial meat, not just bones and gristle, and miraculous for someone who has lived on ship's biscuit and road dust for months. Fresh fruit, an orange, worth a day's wages back home, sits on your plate as if it were common fare. The brother serving you bows slightly as he sets down the food, addressing you as "my lord," and you realize with shock that he means it. In this place, your suffering has made you nobility. The Amalfi merchants and their holy gamble. Before Gerard, before the hospital, before any dream of military orders, there was Mauro of Amalfi, a merchant whose ledgers balanced profit with piety in equal measure. The year was 1020, and Mauro's ships carried more than cargo between Italy and the Levant. They carried pilgrims, hundreds of them, seeking salvation in Jerusalem's holy sites. But too many never returned, not from Saracen swords, but from simple exhaustion, disease, and the shocking absence of any infrastructure to support Christian pilgrims in the Muslim-controlled city. Mauro's solution was brilliantly pragmatic. Together with his fellow merchants from the maritime Republic of Amalfi, he petitioned the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim, known for his eccentricities, but also for his occasional tolerance, offering to establish and fund a hospice for Christian pilgrims. The merchants would pay substantial annual taxes, guarantee the hospice would cause no political troubles, and in return, the Caliph would permit this Christian enclave to operate within sight of the Holy Sepulchre. It was business dressed as charity, ensuring healthier pilgrims who could complete their journeys and return home to encourage others, expanding the lucrative pilgrimage trade. The Caliph, perhaps amused by the audacity or recognizing the economic benefits, agreed. The first hospice was tiny, barely more than a house with 20 beds, staffed by Benedictine monks from Italy. But Mauro had chosen the location with a merchant's eye for future expansion. Adjacent land was quietly purchased over the following years, always through intermediaries, never attracting attention. By 1040, what had begun as a modest shelter had grown into a complex, including a chapel dedicated to St. John the Baptist, separate quarters for male and female pilgrims, and the beginnings of what would become the famous hospital. The transformation from Mauro's commercial venture to Gerard's sacred mission occurred gradually, almost imperceptibly. As the Amalfi merchants aged and died, their endowments shifted from conditional gifts, requiring Italian oversight, to unconditional grants trusting in the hospital's mission. Gerard, who had arrived as a pilgrim and stayed to serve, possessed both the spiritual vision and practical skills to transform a merchant's investment into something unprecedented, a truly international institution that belonged to no single nation, but to Christendom itself, from bandages to blades. The transformation began with a letter, a simple request from King Baldwin I of Jerusalem to the new master of the hospital, Raymond du Puy. In 1120, the kingdom needed men, specifically men who understood logistics, organization, and discipline to help protect the pilgrim routes between Jaffa and Jerusalem. What Baldwin perhaps didn't anticipate was that he had just initiated one of the most significant military evolutions in medieval history. Raymond du Puy was a different creature from the gentle Gerard. Born to minor nobility in Dauphiné, he had arrived in Jerusalem not as a merchant or pilgrim, but as a younger son seeking purpose in the aftermath of the First Crusade's success. His 2 decades of service in the hospital had taught him that mercy without strength was mere sentiment, in a land where pilgrim caravans were regularly massacred within sight of Jerusalem's walls. The brothers could heal the wounded who reached the hospital, but what of those who died in the desert, their bodies left for jackals because no armed force protected them? The rule that Raymond composed between 1120 and 1160 was revolutionary in its synthesis of martial and medical vocations. Brothers would continue to serve the sick. This remained paramount, but some would also train in arms. The distinction was crucial. Not all hospitallers would be warriors, but all warriors would still be hospitallers. A knight brother might spend his morning practicing swordplay and his afternoon changing bandages. This dual identity would persist for 9 centuries. The early military hospitallers were not the heavy cavalry that would later terrorize Muslim armies. They began as escort troops, lightly armed, mobile, expert in the hit-and-run tactics necessary for desert warfare. Their first fortification was not some mighty castle, but a simple tower at Beth Gabelin, commanding the road from Ascalon. From this modest beginning, they learned the art of defensive warfare, how to maximize small numbers through superior position, how to use architecture as a force multiplier. The theological justification for this transformation required delicate reasoning. How could those vowed to heal also kill? Raymond's answer was elegant in its simplicity. The brothers did not abandon their service to the sick by taking up arms. They extended it. Protecting pilgrims from death was merely preventive medicine. The sword that kept a bandit from murdering travellers was as much an instrument of mercy as the scalpel that removed an arrow from flesh. This reasoning, endorsed by Pope Innocent II in 1139, established the Hospitallers as a legitimate military religious order. Opposition came from unexpected quarters. Many within the order itself resisted, arguing that Gerard's pure vision was being corrupted. A significant number of brothers departed, refusing to reconcile warfare with their vows. Others accepted the military role, but insisted on maintaining the primacy of hospital service. This tension between healing and fighting, between mercy and violence, would define the order throughout its history. Even at the height of their military power, controlling dozens of castles and commanding thousands of troops, the Hospitallers never abandoned their hospitals. In Rhodes, in Malta, even during sieges with Turkish cannons demolishing their walls, the hospital wards remained open, brothers moving from battlement to bedside without pause. The rule of service. The rule of Raymond du Puy, approved by Pope Eugenius III in 1153, created something entirely new in Christian society, a religious order that was simultaneously contemplative, charitable, and military. Reading it today, preserved in multiple manuscript copies from the 12th century, one is struck by its comprehensive vision, attempting to regulate every aspect of a brother's life. From dawn prayers to death in battle, the day began at midnight with matins, the night office that all brothers, whether they had spent the previous day in combat or caring for the sick, were required to attend. The prayers were lengthy, combining the traditional monastic hours with specific supplications for pilgrims, for the sick under their care, and remarkably, for their enemies, that God might turn their hearts from violence. After matins came the brief sleep until lauds at dawn, then prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, the rhythm of prayer punctuating whatever other duties filled the day. A knight might recite terce while standing watch on a castle wall, or whisper vespers while riding patrol in the desert. The hospital brothers scheduled their rounds around the canonical hours, ensuring that divine worship never ceased even as they served the sick. The vow of poverty was absolute, but interpreted collectively. Individual brothers owned nothing, not even the clothes they wore, which belonged to the order and could be reassigned at any moment. However, the order itself accumulated vast wealth, justified as necessary for its mission. The silver plates used to serve the sick, the massive fortifications, the ships that would later patrol the Mediterranean, all were owned communally, held in trust for the service of Christendom. This collective wealth created a paradox. Brothers who personally possessed nothing, but collectively commanded resources that rivaled kingdoms. Chastity, the second vow, was enforced with particular strictness. Brothers were forbidden not only from sexual contact, but from any unnecessary interaction with women. Even in the hospital, female patients were tended by sisters of the order when possible, and male brothers were required to work in pairs when treating women, never alone. The penalties for violating chastity were severe, ranging from public whipping to expulsion from the order. Yet the rule also showed surprising psychological sophistication. acknowledging that temptation was inevitable and providing structured means for confession and penance, rather than expecting inhuman perfection. Obedience, the third traditional vow, took on military dimensions in the hospitaller context. A brother was required to obey not just his religious superiors, but his military commanders, even unto death. The rules specifically address situations where obedience might conflict with survival, stating that a brother ordered to hold an indefensible position must do so unless given permission to retreat by his commander, or unless wounded to the point of incapacity. This absolute obedience created the discipline that made hospitaller forces so effective. Enemies knew that these warriors would not break, would not flee, would fight to the last man if ordered. The fourth vow, unique to the Hospitallers, bound them to serve our lords, the sick and poor. This was not mere rhetoric, but a legal obligation with specific requirements. Every brother, regardless of rank, must personally serve in the hospital for designated periods. Grandmasters were observed emptying bedpans. Noble knights born to command thousands could be found spoon-feeding paralyzed patients. This enforced humility served multiple purposes, preventing the military brothers from developing excessive pride, maintaining the order's connection to its founding mission, and ensuring that every hospitaller understood both aspects of their dual vocation. The eight-pointed cross that became the order's symbol carried layered meaning, explained in the rules commentaries. The four arms represented the cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. The 8 points symbolized the 8 beatitudes from Christ's Sermon on the Mount, but also 8 obligations to live in truth, have faith, repent sins, give proof of humility, love, justice, be merciful, be sincere and wholehearted, and endure persecution. This sophisticated symbolism was taught to every novice, ensuring that even illiterate sergeants understood the deeper meaning of the cross they wore. Advancement within the order followed strict protocols. A prospective brother underwent a novitiate of at least 1 year, though often longer, during which he was tested in both military skills and hospital service. Only those who excelled in both could take full vows. The hierarchy was complex, with knight brothers drawn from nobility, sergeant brothers from common stock, and chaplain brothers providing spiritual services. Later, as the order expanded, affiliate members called confratres could participate partially, donating resources and sometimes serving temporarily while maintaining their secular lives. This flexible structure allowed the order to draw support from across Christian society, from kings who became honorary members to merchants who endowed hospital beds. Croix des Chevaliers, stone prayer in the desert. Rising from the Syrian highlands like a geometric mountain born from human will, Croix des Chevaliers stands as perhaps the most perfect expression of military architecture ever achieved by medieval hands. Acquired by the Hospitallers in 1142 from the Count of Tripoli, who could no longer afford its garrison, the castle began as a modest Kurdish fortification. What the knights transformed it into, over the following century defies simple description, a fusion of monastery, fortress, palace, and machine of war that could house 2,000 knights with supplies for 5 years. The outer walls, 60 feet high and 30 feet thick at the base, were not merely defensive but psychological, designed to crush the spirit of any attacker before the first arrow flew. Walking their circuit today, one feels the weight of stone as oppression. Each block fitted so precisely that 8 centuries of earthquakes have barely shifted them. The glacis, that smooth slope of polished stone at the wall's base, made scaling impossible while forcing attackers into carefully calculated killing fields, where every arrow slit, every matriculation, every defensive position had been mathematically determined for maximum lethality. Inside, the castle revealed its dual nature. The chapel, as large as many town churches, contained acoustic perfection that let a single voice carry to every corner, allowing the divine office to be heard even by brothers standing watch on distant towers. The Great Hall could seat 500 for meals that maintained the order's traditions. The sick and wounded given places of honour, served first despite the presence of noble knights. The hospital ward, built into the safest part of the inner keep, featured windows oriented to catch morning light but positioned too high for enemy projectiles, combining therapeutic architecture with defensive necessity. Water, that most precious desert commodity, was managed with almost mystical efficiency. Massive cisterns carved from living rock could hold enough for years, while an elaborate system of channels captured every drop of rain that fell on the castle's vast expanse. The kitchen gardens, protected within the outer bailey, grew herbs both culinary and medicinal, maintaining the hospitaller tradition of herbal medicine even during siege. The storage rooms, cool and dry, preserved grain in pottery jars sealed with wax, a technique learned from Arab neighbours that prevented spoilage far longer than European methods. The castle was never merely defensive. It projected power across the surrounding countryside like a stone sun radiating authority. From its towers, signal fires could communicate with other hospitaller fortifications, creating an early warning network that spanned hundreds of miles. Its garrison could strike out in any direction, protecting Christian pilgrims, raiding Muslim supply lines, enforcing the fragile truces that occasionally brought peace to the contested lands. The castle controlled not just territory but psychology, its silhouette visible for 20 miles, reminding all who saw it that the knights were watching, waiting, ready. The surgeon knights. The transformation of medieval medicine occurred not in the universities of Paris or Padua, but in the desperate efficiency of hospitaller infirmaries, where warrior monks, who had seen the inside of human bodies on battlefields, applied that terrible knowledge to healing. By 1200, the order's medical practices had advanced so far beyond contemporary European standards that Muslim physicians, themselves heirs to advanced Greek and Arab medical traditions, would specifically request to observe hospitaller procedures. The surgical manual compiled by Brother Bartholomew of Cremona in 1195, based on 20 years of practice in the Jerusalem hospital, describes procedures that wouldn't become common in Europe for another 3 centuries. Arrow extraction, using specialized forceps designed by the brothers themselves, achieved survival rates that seemed miraculous to observers accustomed to amputation as the standard response. The manual details the use of wine and mandrake for anesthesia, the importance of cauterization with heated iron rather than the more damaging boiling oil, and most remarkably, the suturing of internal organs, a procedure most European physicians considered impossible. The brothers had learned, through bitter experience, treating crusade casualties, that infection killed more effectively than any blade. Their response was revolutionary: mandatory hand-washing before treating patients, using wine or vinegar solutions that, while they didn't understand the antibacterial properties, demonstrably reduced mortality. Surgical instruments were passed through flame before use, a practice they claimed was for spiritual purification, but which achieved sterilization centuries before germ theory. The hospital floors were washed daily with a solution of lime and vinegar, creating an environment that visiting Persian physicians described as cleaner than most palaces. Diet therapy, learned from Arab medical texts but refined through systematic observation, treated food as medicine. The hospital maintained separate kitchens for different dietary requirements, one for fever patients requiring cooling foods according to humoral theory, another for those with digestive ailments needing bland preparations, a third for the wounded requiring blood-building meats and wines. The order's rules specified that patients must receive whatever foods they desired if available, a radical departure from the punitive dietary restrictions common in European medicine, where suffering was often considered spiritually beneficial. The medical knowledge was preserved and transmitted through an apprenticeship system that prefigured modern medical education. Young brothers, with aptitude for healing, were assigned to experienced surgeons, following them through years of observation. before being allowed to practice independently. They maintain detailed case records, unusual for the time, noting treatments, outcomes, and modifications to standard procedures. These records, partially preserved in the Vatican secret archives, show a primitive but effective form of evidence-based medicine, with treatments modified based on observed results, rather than theoretical considerations. Mental illness, generally attributed to demonic possession in medieval Europe, received surprisingly sophisticated treatment in hospitaler facilities. Separate wards for those suffering from what the brothers called diseases of the mind provided quiet environments, regular routines, and occupational therapy in the form of garden work or simple crafts. While they still performed exorcisms, these were gentle affairs, more counselling than confrontation, combined with herbal treatments including St. John's wort, which modern medicine has validated as an effective antidepressant. The brothers recognized that many knights suffered from what we would now call post-traumatic stress, providing specific treatments including confession, penance, and gradual reintegration into community life, rather than isolation or punishment. You march with the black banner. You are Brother Guillaume of Provence, 3 years since your vows, and this morning you will face your first true battle. The year is 1187, and Saladin's army surrounds the springs of Cresson. Your hand grips the leather-wrapped handle of your sword, the blade blessed by the chaplain at dawn, while sweat already pools beneath your mail despite the morning coolness. The black banner of the order snaps above your squadron, the white cross stark against its field, and you remember your master's words from training that banner falls only when the last hospitaller falls. Your horse shifts nervously beneath you, sensing the tension that runs through the assembled knights like lightning through iron. 140 hospitallers, along with 40 secular knights, face an enemy that numbers in thousands. The rational mind, the one that calculated supplies and managed hospital stores just yesterday, screams that this is madness. But the vows you took override reason. When the martial signals advance, you will charge. There is no other option, not because of courage, but because of obedience, that terrible, liberating submission to something greater than personal survival. The Turkish drums begin, a rhythm that seems to emerge from the earth itself, and your mouth goes dry as dust. You think absurdly of the hospital well in Jerusalem, the cool water you drew for patients just last week, how you'll never taste it again. The brother beside you, old Jacques, who taught you sword work, is muttering prayers in Occitan, his home tongue emerging under stress. You want to pray too, but the words won't come, frozen somewhere between your heart and throat. Instead, you focus on breathing, on the weight of your armor, on the simple, physical reality of existence. In this moment before everything changes, the marshal raises his lance, the signal you've dreaded and anticipated, and suddenly you're moving, not through conscious decision, but carried forward by training, by the mass of horses accelerating around you, by the battle cry that tears from your throat without thought. The Turkish arrows begin falling when you're 50 yards out, a sound like metal rain. And brothers begin falling, but you can't look, can't think, can only lean forward behind your shield and trust that God wants you alive for another few seconds. The impact, when it comes, is nothing like training. Your lance catches a Turkish soldier centre mass, the shock travelling up your arm like striking stone, and then you're through their first line, sword out now, chopping down at faces and reaching hands in a red haze that makes time meaningless. Somewhere in the melee, your horse dies, a Turkish spear through its neck, and you're on foot in a forest of legs and blades. Training takes over, the endless drills in the courtyard of Jerusalem, and you're fighting in a circle with 3 other brothers, backs together, swords weaving patterns of survival. Jacques is down. His last word, not a prayer, but your name, calling you to witness his death. The banner still flies somewhere behind you, meaning the battle continues, meaning you cannot yield, cannot run, can only keep your sword moving until it grows too heavy to lift. When the Turkish withdrawal finally comes, as sudden as summer lightning, you're kneeling in mud that was dust an hour ago, now transformed by blood into something that will haunt your dreams. Of 140 Hospitallers who charged, perhaps 30 remain standing. You survived not through skill or courage, but through the incomprehensible mathematics of battle that spare some and take others without logic or justice. Your hands shake so badly you cannot remove your gauntlets, and a secular knight, one of the few remaining, has to help you, his eyes holding the same hollow shock you feel. Tomorrow, if there is one, you'll return to the hospital, to the familiar routines of caring for the sick. But you're different now, initiated into the terrible brotherhood of those who've seen the face of war and somehow walked away. Saladin's respect. The letter arrived at the siege camp outside Kerak in 1183, carried by a Hospitaller sergeant under a flag of truce. Grand Master Roger de Moulins read it twice before sharing its contents with his council, unable to initially believe what Saladin, the great enemy of Christendom, had written. The Sultan was proposing something unprecedented, a formal arrangement for the treatment of wounded soldiers, both Christian and Muslim, in Hospitaller facilities. The context was remarkable. During the previous year's campaigns, Saladin had observed Hospitaller brothers treating captured Muslim soldiers with the same care given to Christian knights. His own physician, the Jewish philosopher Maimonides, had confirmed reports of Hospitaller medical practices that surpassed anything available in Cairo or Damascus. The Sultan, pragmatic, despite the religious war raging around him, recognized an opportunity for his own wounded, while offering the Christians similar, reciprocal treatment. The arrangement, formalized through careful negotiations conducted in French, Arabic, and Latin, established something approaching the modern concept of medical neutrality. Hospitaller facilities would be considered immune from attack during specified periods. Wounded soldiers of both faiths could be ransomed after recovery rather than executed. Most remarkably, physicians could cross battle lines under safe conduct to study treatments and share medical knowledge. The agreement horrified hardliners on both sides. Templars accused the Hospitallers of apostasy, while Saladin's own emirs whispered about weakness, but it held, creating islands of mercy in an ocean of brutality. The practical benefits were immediate. Brother William of Tyre, chronicling these years, records how Egyptian physicians introduced the Hospitallers to advanced surgical techniques for treating abdominal wounds, while Hospitaller brothers shared their knowledge of battlefield triage and mass casualty management. The exchange went beyond medicine. Through these interactions, cultural knowledge flowed, languages were learned, and the enemy acquired human faces. Several recorded instances exist of knights and emirs, having met in hospital wards, refusing to fight each other in subsequent battles, creating small tears in the fabric of total war. The arrangement's end came not through betrayal, but victory. When Saladin recaptured Jerusalem in 1187, he honoured the agreement's spirit, even as its letter became obsolete. The Hospitaller brothers were given safe conduct to evacuate their patients, Christian and Muslim alike, to their remaining strongholds. Saladin personally visited the Jerusalem hospital before its evacuation, and according to his secretary Ahmad ad-Din, wept at seeing the care provided to wounded Muslim soldiers. He ordered that the hospital continue operating under Muslim management, but maintaining Hospitaller methods, a tribute to the order's medical excellence that transcended religious hatred. The fall of Acre. The morning of May 18th, 1291, dawned blood-red through the smoke of Greek fire, and every soul within Acre's walls knew this was the last sunrise they would see from the greatest crusader city. The Hospitaller fortress, built into the city's northwest corner, had become an island of resistance in an ocean of Mamluk soldiers. Grand Master Jean de Villiers, his left arm useless from a Turkish arrow, conducted the defence from a chair, too weak to stand, but too stubborn to yield command. For 6 weeks, the siege had ground forward with inevitable mathematics. Sultan Khalil commanded perhaps 80,000 men against Acre's 15,000 defenders. The revolutionary counterweight trebuchets he had brought from Damascus could throw stones weighing half a ton, reducing walls that had stood for a century to rubble in days. The Hospitallers' section of wall, reinforced continuously for decades, lasted longest, but even stone has limits. By mid-May, 3 major breaches gaped like mouths screaming toward the sea. The night before the final assault, the Hospitaller treasury was loaded onto galleys. Not gold and silver, though there was plenty, but something more precious. The order's archives, medical texts, architectural plans, and the accumulated knowledge of 2 centuries in the Holy Land. Brother Matthew of Claremont, the order's chronicler, spent his last hours ensuring these documents reached the ships, understanding that while Acre would fall, the order's intellectual heritage might survive to serve future generations. The final assault began before dawn, with a bombardment that survivors described as hell made manifest. Mamluk mangonels, catapults, and trebuchets fired continuously, their stones striking with rhythms that seemed to shake the earth's foundations. Greek fire, that terrible Byzantine invention the Muslims had perfected, turned the air itself into an enemy. Men burned while standing in full armour, the metal conducting heat until knights cooked inside their own protection. The Hospitaller infirmary, maintained operational despite the siege, filled with burn victims beyond counting, brothers applying honey and wine to wounds that would have been fatal anywhere else. When the Mamluks finally poured through the breaches, the fighting devolved into something primitive and personal. In the narrow streets behind the walls, cavalry advantage disappeared. This was knife work, desperate and intimate. Hospitaller brothers fought in their hospital robes when their armour became too damaged, black cloth turning red, then brown as blood, dried in the Palestinian heat. The order's banner, that black field with its white cross, changed hands 7 times in an hour, brothers dying to reclaim it, understanding that its fall meant more than military defeat. It meant the end of their purpose in the Holy Land. Grandmaster de Villiers was carried to the ships unconscious, over his protests when he briefly woke. Of approximately 300 Hospitaller knights in Acre when the siege began, 7 escaped to the galleys. The sergeants and foot soldiers fared worse, most dying at their posts or in the massacre that followed the wall's collapse. The last coherent unit of Hospitallers held the entrance to the harbour for 3 hours after the city fell, buying time for refugee ships to escape. They fought in a closing circle, singing the Salve Regina as their numbers dwindled, until the last brother fell silent, and Acre belonged entirely to Islam. Wandering nights, the Cyprus years. The galleys that fled Acre's flames carried more than exhausted survivors. They transported an entire institution suddenly severed from its purpose. Cyprus, where King Henry II offered grudging sanctuary, became a purgatory of uncertainty. The Hospitallers, reduced to perhaps 40 knights and a few hundred sergeants, faced an existential crisis that no amount of martial valour could resolve. Without the Holy Land, what was a crusading order? In Limassol's temporary headquarters, a merchant's warehouse hastily consecrated as their conventual church, Grandmaster Jean de Villiers convened daily chapters that grew increasingly desperate. The treasury, though substantial, bled steadily without the revenues from Palestinian estates. Younger brothers spoke of joining the Iberian Reconquista, elder ones of accepting the Teutonic Knights' invitation to fight Baltic pagans. The fundamental question, whispered but never formally debated, was whether the order should simply dissolve. Its mission conclusively failed. The hospital, that anchor of Hospitaller identity, saved them from dissolution. Even in exile, brothers maintained a medical facility in Limassol, treating Cyprus's poor, continuing their fourth vow despite having no pilgrims to serve. This continuity of purpose, the daily routine of caring for the sick, provided structure, while the order's leadership desperately sought a new strategic vision. The infirmary's familiar rhythms, the canonical hours balanced with medical rounds, reminded the brothers that they were more than just defeated soldiers. Master Guillaume de Villeray, who succeeded his mortally wounded predecessor, possessed a strategic mind that saw opportunity where others saw only catastrophe. If the order could not reclaim the Holy Land, perhaps it could control the sea routes that might one day enable that reconquest. The Eastern Mediterranean was plagued by piracy, Muslim corsairs from Alexandria and Anatolia, making maritime pilgrimage almost impossible. What if the Hospitallers transformed themselves from land-based knights to naval warriors, exchanging castles for ships, siege warfare for maritime patrol, the conquest of Rhodes? The plan was audacious, beyond reason. Rhodes, that mountainous island commanding the sea routes between Europe and the Levant, belonged nominally to Byzantium, but actually to whoever could hold it. Greek pirates, Turkish raiders, and Genoese merchants contested its harbours, while the Byzantine governor cowered in his palace, controlling little beyond the capital's walls. Guillaume de Villeray proposed that 300 knights and perhaps 2,000 soldiers could capture and hold an island the size of English Bedfordshire, then transform it into an impregnable base for the order's resurrection. The conquest, beginning in 1306, took 4 years and nearly destroyed the order through expense and casualties. The initial landing succeeded through surprise, the Hospitallers arriving in galleys supposedly carrying grain merchants. But holding the beaches proved easier than taking the fortified city. Byzantine defenders, though few and demoralized, held stone walls that had resisted sieges since ancient times. The order's experience with fortification worked in reverse now. They knew too well how difficult proper walls were to breach without the massive siege engines left behind in Palestine. Falques de Villeret, who had succeeded his uncle as Grand Master, solved the problem through economics rather than violence. Genoese merchants were offered exclusive trading privileges if they provided loans and naval support. Local Greek populations were guaranteed their orthodox faith and property rights if they accepted Hospitaller rule. Turkish raids were repelled with such efficiency that even Muslim merchants began requesting safe conduct to trade in Rhodes. Within 2 years, the island's economy had improved so dramatically that Byzantine resistance collapsed from within, unpaid soldiers opening gates to new masters who actually paid wages. The transformation of Rhodes from conquered territory to Hospitaller homeland required innovations that would define the order for 2 centuries. The Calascio, a fortified quarter exclusively for the knights, created a militarized monastery within the city. 8 auberges, one for each langa or national grouping within the order, maintained distinct cultural identities while serving unified command. The hospital, rebuilt to standards exceeding even Jerusalem's facility, could accommodate 500 patients. Most remarkably, the order established a naval arsenal capable of building and maintaining a fleet that would eventually dominate the Eastern Mediterranean. Masters of the Mediterranean wind, listen to the wind singing through Rhodes harbour at dusk, rattling the rigging of war galleys drawn up on the beach like sleeping dragons. Salt crystallizes on bronze cannons that point toward the darkening horizon where Turkish sails might appear with any dawn. The air itself tastes of transformation, as an order born in desert dust learns the language of tides and storms, of naval tactics that would have bewildered their Jerusalem predecessors. The Hospitallers' evolution into a naval power was not planned, but emerged from necessity, interpreted through innovation. Their first ships were converted merchant vessels, round-bellied traders transformed into fighters by adding wooden castles fore and aft. But by 1350, the order's shipwrights were designing purpose-built war galleys that incorporated Greek fire projectors, reinforced ramming prows, and the earliest naval cannons in the Mediterranean. The flagship, inevitably named Santa Maria, carried 300 rowers and 100 marines, making it a floating fortress capable of engaging entire pirate squadrons. The rhythms of naval life transformed hospitaller culture in subtle but profound ways. The rigid hierarchy of the convent relaxed slightly aboard ship, where competence mattered more than noble birth. A sergeant who could navigate by stars might command knights during voyages. The international character of the order proved advantageous at sea. French knights knew Atlantic sailing, Italians understood Mediterranean navigation, Spanish brothers brought knowledge of new artillery techniques. This fusion of maritime traditions created a naval doctrine that was uniquely hospitaller, combining the disciplined ferocity of military monasticism with the technical innovation of Renaissance seafaring. The sovereign military order. The papal bull of 1312 changed everything with a few drops of sealing wax. Pope Clement V, pressured by Philip IV of France to suppress the Templars, needed to demonstrate that he wasn't simply attacking military orders wholesale. His solution was to elevate the Hospitallers to unprecedented status. They would be not just exempt from local ecclesiastical authority, but recognized as a sovereign entity, capable of conducting diplomacy, minting currency, and maintaining armed forces independent of any earthly kingdom. This sovereignty was not merely theoretical. By 1350, the Hospitaller state on Rhodes functioned with all the apparatus of contemporary kingdoms. They minted silver gigliati coins that became the preferred currency for Eastern Mediterranean trade. Their reliability, backed by the order's reputation for financial probity. The Grand Master received ambassadors from European courts and the Mamluk Sultanate alike, negotiating treaties that bound the order as a sovereign equal. They maintained their own legal system, with courts that tried both brothers and civilians living under their protection, creating a body of maritime law that influenced Mediterranean commerce for centuries. The economic foundation of this sovereignty proved remarkably sophisticated. Beyond traditional feudal revenues from their European estates, the Hospitallers developed diversified income streams that would seem modern to contemporary eyes. They operated as venture capitalists, funding trading expeditions in exchange for profit shares. Their monopoly on certain trade routes was leased to merchant consortiums for substantial fees. The hospital itself became a profit centre, wealthy patients paying enormous sums for treatment that subsidised free care for the poor. By 1400, the order's annual revenues exceeded those of many European kingdoms. The bureaucracy required to manage this complexity evolved from monastic simplicity to Renaissance sophistication. The conventual prior supervised spiritual matters, maintaining the religious character that legitimized all else. The marshal commanded military forces that now included not just knights but hired soldiers, allied contingents, and naval personnel from across Europe. The Hospitaller managed the medical facilities that had grown to include satellite hospitals on other islands and mainland ports. The Draper controlled the order's vast procurement network, ensuring supplies flowed from European commanderies to Rhodes without interruption. The treasurer, perhaps most powerful of all, managed finances that required understanding of international exchange rates, complex credit instruments, and the political economy of a dozen different kingdoms. Yet sovereignty brought its own challenges. The order was now a state that could be attacked under the accepted laws of war, not just a religious institution whose assault brought automatic excommunication. They had to maintain diplomatic relations even with powers they despised, leading to the strange spectacle of Hospitaller ambassadors at the Ottoman court, negotiating ransoms and truces with the very power they existed to fight. The wealth required to maintain sovereignty attracted corruption, brothers who had taken vows of poverty and managing treasuries that could buy counties. Several Grand Masters faced internal revolts from brothers who felt the order had strayed too far from Gerard's original vision of humble service. The most profound impact of sovereignty was psychological. The Hospitallers were no longer guests in other men's kingdoms, dependent on royal favour and vulnerable to political changes. They were princes of their own realm, however small, masters of their own destiny. This confidence permeated everything from their architectural ambitions, the palace of the Grand Masters, rivaling any European court, to their military strategy, no longer reactive but actively projecting power across the eastern Mediterranean. When Ottoman ambassadors arrived in Rhodes, they negotiated with equals, not suppliants, a transformation from the desperate refugees who had fled Acre merely a generation before. You walk the Calascio at dusk. You are a young knight from Provence, newly arrived in Rhodes after your year's novitiate, and this evening, walk through the street of knights fills you with awe that training never prepared you for. The sun drops toward the harbour, painting limestone walls the colour of honey and blood, while church bells call the brothers to vespers, your soft leather shoes, a luxury after months in military boots, whisper against stones worn smooth by 2 centuries of similar footsteps. The street rises gently from the harbour toward the palace, lined with the aubergines of each langue, architectural embodiments of the order's international character. You pass the Auberge of France, its facade decorated with fleurs-de-lis, carved so delicately, they seem to flutter in the evening breeze. Through open windows drift voices arguing in French about the proper deployment of cavalry, a debate that could have occurred in Paris, except for the occasional Latin phrase or reference to Turkish tactics. The smell of wine and roasted lamb escapes from their kitchens, reminding you that despite vows of poverty, the order knows how to maintain morale through controlled indulgence. The Auberge of Italy stands opposite, its architecture somehow more florid, with Renaissance decorations that would seem frivolous except for their perfect execution. Italian brothers gather in its courtyard, around a fountain that wouldn't disgrace a Venetian palazzo, discussing in rapid dialect the latest innovations in naval artillery. One demonstrates a point using hand gestures that transform the air into a battlefield, and you understand without knowing their language that they're debating angles of fire from the harbour fortifications. Further up, the Auberge of Spain maintains Castilian severity, its walls undecorated, save for a massive coat of arms, combining the Order's cross with Spanish heraldry. The brothers here train even during rest hours, the clash of practice swords echoing from their courtyard, where they maintain the tradition of daily combat drill, regardless of weather or season. Their dedication intimidates you. These men who fought Moors in Iberia before coming east, bringing a particularly harsh edge to an already militant order. Your own auberge, that of Provence, feels like home despite being 2,000 miles from your birthplace. The accent of home greets you as you enter. Brothers from Marseille and Avignon, creating a linguistic island in this polyglot sea. Your cell, barely large enough for a bed and prayer stand, overlooks an herb garden where medicinal plants from across Europe somehow thrive in Rhodian soil. The brother assigned as your mentor, a veteran of 15 years' service, has left a copy of the rule on your bed, marked at passages particularly relevant to new arrivals. A kindness that almost brings tears after months of harsh training. As Vespers bells grow insistent, you join the stream of black-robed figures converging on the conventual church. Knights from 8 nations walk together in prescribed order, their individual identities subsumed into collective purpose. Yet differences remain visible in subtle ways. The way Germans march in perfect synchronization, how English brothers maintain slightly greater personal space, the tendency of French knights to continue conversations until the church door itself. Inside, as voices rise in the Salve Regina, these distinctions vanish. 800 male voices, trained in different languages but united in Latin prayer, create harmonies that seem to shake the stone itself. You understand in this moment what sovereignty means, not just political independence, but the creation of something entirely new, a nation defined not by blood or soil, but by vows and purpose. The hospital ship, the Santa Stefania, rolled gently in Rhodes harbour. Her hull black as a hospitaler's robe, her sails marked with the 8-pointed cross that warned pirates and welcomed merchants throughout the Mediterranean. Launched in 1445, she represented an innovation that would not be replicated by other navies for 400 years. A ship designed primarily as a floating hospital, capable of providing medical care while underway, transforming naval warfare's brutal mathematics. Brother Antonio of Pisa, the ship's senior surgeon, had overseen her design with fanatical attention to medical requirements. The surgery, located amidships where motion was least, featured gimbaled tables that remained level despite the ship's roll, allowing delicate operations, even in rough seas. Windows of precious glass, sealed with lead and capable of opening for ventilation, provided light without admitting spray. Instruments, secured in felt-lined drawers, included innovations unknown to land-based surgeons, specialized tools for extracting arrows shot from below, bone saws designed for use in confined spaces, cauterization irons that could be heated by the ship's galley fires. The dispensary, adjacent to the surgery, contained medicines that represented global trade networks, opium from Egypt for pain, cinchona bark from mysterious western lands the Spanish had discovered, mercury from German mines for treating the new disease sailors, brought from every port, herbs from Rhodes's own gardens dried and preserved in ceramic jars. The brother apothecary, usually an elderly knight whose fighting days were past, managed this pharmaceutical treasury with the precision of a banker, understanding that proper medicine could save more lives than any armour. The ship's most revolutionary feature was its water purification system. Observing that sailors sickened from stagnant water more than wounds, the Hospitallers had developed a method of filtering water through sand and charcoal, then adding small amounts of wine to prevent corruption. The Santa Stefania carried 3 times the normal water supply, stored in lead-lined tanks that could be cleaned between voyages. This abundance of clean water, combined with mandatory washing stations for the medical staff, created hygiene standards that wouldn't become normal in naval medicine until the 19th century. Her first major test came during the sea battle off Imbros in 1447, when Hospitaller galleys engaged a superior Ottoman fleet attempting to raid Christian shipping. The Santa Stefania held back from the main engagement, but as damaged Christian galleys limped toward her, she became a battlefield hospital, processing casualties at rates that would challenge modern emergency rooms. Brothers worked in shifts, some treating wounded on deck, others preparing the recovered for transport below, still others managing the triage that determined who could be saved and who would receive only comfort and last rites. By battle's end, she had treated over 300 casualties, saving lives that conventional naval warfare would have written off as dead the moment they were wounded. Suleiman's shadow lengthens. By 1520, every morning prayer in Rhodes included a petition for deliverance from the Ottoman threat that grew like storm clouds on the eastern horizon. Suleiman the Magnificent, young and ambitious, had made no secret of his intention to complete what his great-grandfather Mehmed the Conqueror had attempted, the elimination of this Christian thorn in Islam's maritime flesh. The Hospitallers, now numbering barely 500 knights, supplemented by 2,000 soldiers and perhaps 5,000 civilian militia, faced an empire that could marshal hundreds of thousands. Grand Master Philippe Villiers de l'Isle Adam, elected just months before the crisis deepened, combined French military pragmatism with an engineer's eye for defensive possibilities. Under his direction, Rhodes's fortifications were revolutionized to face the reality of gunpowder warfare. Medieval walls were backed with earth ramparts that absorbed cannon impact, rather than shattering. Angled bastions replaced round towers, providing overlapping fields of fire that turned every approach into a killing ground. The city's civilians, understanding their fate if the Turks conquered, worked alongside the knights, children carrying baskets of earth while their grandmothers sewed sandbags. The Ottoman fleet appeared on June 26, 1522, 400 ships, darkening the horizon like a plague of locusts. Contemporary accounts vary, but likely 100,000 soldiers disembarked, along with siege equipment that beggared imagination. Bronze cannons that required 50 oxen to move, trebuchets that could throw incendiary bombs weighing 500 pounds, mining equipment operated by Serbian silver miners who could tunnel through solid rock. Against this, the Hospitallers could muster perhaps 6,000 defenders, counting every man capable of holding a weapon. The siege that followed became legend on both sides. For 6 months, Rhodes endured bombardment that turned entire quarters to rubble. The Turks fired over 3,000 cannonballs daily at the siege's height, a weight of metal that should have pulverized any defense. Yet the knights held, their earth-backed walls absorbing impacts that would have shattered stone. Their counter-mining efforts, led by a brilliant Jewish engineer named Gabriele Tadino, repeatedly foiling Ottoman attempts to place explosive charges beneath the fortifications. When breaches were finally blown, the defenders were waiting with secondary walls built from rubble, turning every Ottoman success into another layer of defense, requiring another month of bombardment. The human cost defied comprehension. By December, fewer than 200 Hospitallers remained unwounded. Civilians ate rats, then leather, then grass. The hospital, maintained operational throughout the siege, despite taking several direct hits, treated Christians and Muslim prisoners alike, maintaining the order's medical traditions even as their world collapsed around them. Ottoman losses were worse, perhaps 50,000 dead, including Suleiman's favourite commanders. The Sultan, watching from his pavilion, allegedly wept at seeing his elite janissaries cut down, attempting to storm positions defended by handfuls of exhausted knights. 8 knights, 8 languages. The langue system that governed Rhodes was more than administrative convenience. It was a living experiment in international governance that anticipated the European Union by 5 centuries. Each of the order's 8 linguistic divisions, France, Auvergne, Provence, Spain, Aragon, Italy, Germany, and England, maintained distinct identity while serving unified command. This delicate balance between nationalism and supranational purpose created both the order's greatest strength and its persistent internal tensions. The French contingent, technically 3 separate langues but often acting in concert, dominated through numbers and wealth. Their commanderies from Normandy to Aquitaine generated revenues that dwarfed other nations' contributions. This financial power translated to political influence. French Grand Masters ruled for nearly 2 centuries continuous, creating resentment that occasionally erupted into near revolt. Yet French organisational genius also gave the order its administrative structure, legal framework, and diplomatic protocols that allowed 8 fractious nationalities to function as one military force. The Spanish Knights, combining Castilian intensity with Aragonese maritime expertise, brought a particular fieriness to the order's military character. Veterans of the Reconquista, they viewed conflict with Islam not as political necessity, but as divine mandate. Their contributions went beyond martial prowess. Spanish commanderies in the Americas, established as Spain's empire expanded, eventually provided silver that funded the order's Mediterranean operations. The tension between Spanish religious absolutism and the pragmatic accommodations necessary for survival in the polyglot Mediterranean created philosophical debates that raged in chapter meetings for generations. Italian brothers, divided by the politics of their fragmented homeland but united by Renaissance sophistication, provided the order's cultural and intellectual leadership. They designed the fortifications, managed the banking relationships, and maintained the diplomatic correspondence that kept the order connected to European power centres. The Hospital of Rhodes under Italian leadership became a medical school that attracted students from across Europe, spreading hospital and medical innovations far beyond the order's direct reach. Yet Italian brothers also brought their homeland's endemic factionalism, Venetians scheming against Genoese, Romans suspicious of Neapolitans, creating divisions that occasionally paralyzed decision-making. The German Lang, including brothers from the Holy Roman Empire's bewildering array of principalities, contributed engineering expertise and military discipline that made them indispensable despite their smaller numbers. German knights supervised the order's artillery, their methodical approach to gunpowder warfare giving Rhodes defensive capabilities that exceeded many European capitals. They maintained their own architectural style in their auberge, Gothic severity that contrasted with Mediterranean elaboration, a physical manifestation of cultural differences that went deeper than language. The English presence, always smallest and most precarious, reflected their homeland's complicated relationship with continental Catholicism. After Henry VIII's break with Rome, the English Langer effectively ceased to exist, their properties confiscated, their brothers either apostatizing or living in exile. Yet during their participation, English knights brought maritime innovations from their island nation, techniques for fighting in rough seas that proved invaluable during winter campaigns, when Mediterranean powers traditionally suspended naval operations. This international character created a unique military culture. Battle commands were given in Latin or Italian, but each Lang fought under its own officers in its native language. Training methods varied dramatically, French knights favouring heavy cavalry tactics, useless on Rhodes's mountainous terrain, while Spanish brothers excelled at siege warfare, learned fighting Moorish castles. These differences were gradually synthesized into a distinctly hospitaller way of war that took each nation's strengths while discarding parochial weaknesses. The resulting force, though never large, achieved a professionalism and adaptability that made them formidable beyond their numbers. Sailing into exile, December 21st, 1522, dawned grey and bitter as the surviving knights of Rhodes prepared for a departure that felt like death itself. Grand Master Lila Dam had negotiated terms that Suleiman, exhausted by the siege's cost, found acceptable. The knights could leave with full military honours, taking their archives, treasury, and any civilians who chose exile over Ottoman rule. The Sultan, in a gesture of respect that surprised his own commanders, provided ships to supplement the order's fleet and guaranteed safe passage to any Christian port. The procession from the Calascio to the harbour was a funeral march for the living. Knights who had defended breaches against impossible odds now wept openly as they walked streets their predecessors had patrolled for 2 centuries. The famous Street of Knights, scarred by bombardment but still standing, witnessed its final parade of black-robed warriors. Citizens who had chosen to remain, mostly Greeks who expected reasonable treatment from the Ottomans, lined the route in silence. Some kissed the knights' hands or touched their robes, understanding they witnessed the end of an epoch. In the harbour, the order's fleet waited like a floating monastery. The Carrack Santana, serving as Lizal Adams' flagship, carried the order's most precious possessions. Not gold or silver, though there was plenty of both, but the archives that documented 6 centuries of existence, medical texts that represented the accumulated knowledge of treating hundreds of thousands of patients, architectural plans for fortifications from Jerusalem to Rhodes. These documents, loaded with the care usually reserved for religious relics, would enable the order's resurrection wherever they finally settled. The human cargo was equally precious and pitiful. Perhaps 180 knights survived unwounded. Another 50 bore injuries that would kill many during the voyage. 4,000 civilians, mostly Latin Christians who feared life under Islamic rule, crowded onto ships designed for half that number. The hospital staff, maintaining their duties despite catastrophic loss, set up temporary medical facilities in the ship's holds, preparing for the inevitable diseases that would spread through such overcrowded conditions. The last aboard was Lizal Adam himself, who tradition claims turned back for a final look at Rhodes and said, "We leave this place through no fault of our arms, but by the will of God, who perhaps preserves us for greater service." The wandering years. 7 years of humiliation followed, worse perhaps than the siege itself, because it was survived in full view of European courts that had promised aid but delivered only sympathy. The fleet wandered the Mediterranean like the Flying Dutchman of later legend, seeking a homeland that seemed perpetually out of reach. Messina provided temporary refuge until local politics made their presence untenable. Viterbo offered sanctuary that proved illusory when papal politics shifted. Nice seemed promising until French and imperial rivalry made the knight's presence a diplomatic liability. During these wandering years, the order hemorrhaged members who saw no future in an institution without territory. Younger knights departed for secular service, their vows apparently dissolved by the order's effective dissolution. The treasury, substantial when they left Rhodes, depleted rapidly without incoming revenues from commanderies that questioned whether they should continue supporting a non-existent state. Several national langs threatened to withdraw entirely, establishing independent national orders that would serve their homeland's interests rather than a phantom international brotherhood. What saved them was the hospital, that constant thread connecting them to their origins. Wherever they anchored, the brothers established temporary medical facilities, treating local populations who had never experienced such professional care. In Messina, they controlled a plague outbreak that would have devastated Sicily. In Viterbo, they introduced surgical techniques that local physicians studied and spread throughout the Papal States. These services generated goodwill that translated into political support, reminding European powers that the Hospitallers offered practical benefits beyond their symbolic value as defenders of Christendom. Malta, the barren gift. When Emperor Charles V offered Malta in 1530, many knights considered it an insult disguised as generosity. The archipelago was everything Rhodes was not. Barren where Rhodes was fertile, strategically marginal where Rhodes commanded vital sea routes, populated by perhaps 12,000 suspicious inhabitants who spoke an Arabic dialect incomprehensible to European ears. The annual tribute of a single falcon to the emperor's viceroy in Sicily seemed appropriate for islands that appeared worth little more. Grandmaster Liladam, old now and exhausted by 7 years of nomadic humiliation, understood what younger critics missed. Malta might be barren, but it was sovereign territory where the order could rebuild without interference. The harbour, though undeveloped, was one of the finest natural anchorages in the Mediterranean, capable of sheltering an entire fleet. The island's position between Sicily and North Africa made them ideal for intercepting both Ottoman expansion westward and Barbary pirate raids northward. Most importantly, accepting Malta committed Charles V to the order's defence, making any attack on the islands an attack on the Habsburg Empire itself. The transformation began immediately. Engineers who had fortified Rhodes surveyed Malta's harbours with professional eyes, seeing not the primitive fishing villages that existed, but the impregnable fortress that could be built. The capital, Mdina, was reinforced but recognised as indefensible against modern artillery. The real focus shifted to the harbour area, where fishing villages would be transformed into Burgu and Senglia, fortified peninsulas that would make any attacker pay in blood for every yard of advance. Burgu, forging fortress from stone. The limestone of Malta, soft enough to carve with hand tools, but hardening to iron toughness when exposed to air, proved ideal for rapid fortification. Within 5 years of arrival, Burgu had been transformed from a fishing village into a military engineer's dream of overlapping fields of fire and mutually supporting positions. The Fort St. Angelo, built on a peninsula commanding the harbour entrance, became the order's headquarters, combining palace, convent, and fortress in a structure that seemed to grow from the living rock. The fortifications were revolutionary in their incorporation of lessons learned from Rhodes's siege. Every wall was backed by earth ramparts that absorbed cannon impact. Every tower was angled to eliminate blind spots where attackers could shelter. Underground tunnels, carved through solid rock by Maltese labourers who became expert miners, connected defensive positions, allowing reinforcements to move without exposure to enemy fire. Cisterns were carved beneath every major fortification, ensuring water supplies couldn't be cut. Magazines were distributed rather than centralized, preventing a single lucky hit from eliminating gunpowder supplies. The Maltese population, initially suspicious of their new overlords, gradually recognized that hospitaller rule brought unexpected benefits. The knights paid fairly for labor and materials, injecting currency into an economy that had operated largely through barter. The hospital, established in Burgu within 2 years of arrival, provided free medical care that transformed public health. The order's navy cleared, surrounding waters of pirates who had raided Maltese fishing boats for generations. By 1540, when Ottoman scouts first reported on Malta's defences, the islands had been transformed from vulnerable backwater to one of the most fortified positions in the Mediterranean. The human architecture of Malta proved as important as the stone fortifications. The knights, learning from Rhodes's experience, cultivated the local nobility, offering younger sons positions in the order's administration and military. They respected local customs, allowing Maltese law to govern civilian matters, while imposing hospitaller military discipline only on strategic issues. The unique Maltese language, incomprehensible to most Europeans, was preserved and even studied by some knights, who recognized its utility for coded communications. This cultural synthesis created a loyalty that would prove crucial when Ottoman invasion finally came. You stand watch as the Ottoman fleet appears. You are Brother Jean de la Cassière, a knight of Auvergne, and this 18th morning of May, 1565, you stand on Fort St. Elmo's ramparts as dawn reveals what everyone feared, but somehow never quite believed would actually happen. The sea has disappeared, replaced by Ottoman sails stretching to the horizon, a wooden city of masts, and rigging that transforms the Mediterranean into a Turkish lake. Your mouth, already dry from the pre-dawn watch, becomes a desert as you try to count the ships and give up at 200, understanding that precision hardly matters when facing the impossible. The fortress beneath your feet, built on a spur of rock commanding the harbour entrance, suddenly feels less like stone and more like sand, waiting to be washed away by the tide now approaching. You know the numbers with mathematical cruelty. Perhaps 700 knights in all of Malta, maybe 8,000 soldiers and militia, against what the scouts report as 40,000 Ottoman troops with the finest siege equipment in the world. The Fort St. Elmo where you stand, the key to everything, holds 150 knights and perhaps 500 soldiers. You will all die here, everyone knows it. The question is whether you can die slowly enough to save Malta. The Turkish fleet begins its choreographed approach, galleys moving with the precision of a court dance, demonstrating their overwhelming power before a single shot is fired. You recognize the flagship of Piale Pasha, the Ottoman admiral, by its 3 lanterns and green banner. Beside it sails Dragut Squadron, the corsair whose very name makes Christian mothers clutch their children. These are not wild pirates, but the Ottoman Empire's finest naval forces, veterans of 100 victories, coming to finish what Suleiman started at Rhodes 40 years ago. Below in the courtyard, your brothers are taking communion, understanding this might be the last time. The chaplain's voice carries up to the walls. Latin phrases worn smooth by centuries of repetition, yet carrying fresh meaning when death watches from just beyond cannon range. You should join them. Protocol demands it, but someone must watch, must witness this moment, when the order's survival balances on a knife's edge. The Grand Master, Jean de Valette, has made it clear, if St. Elmo falls quickly, Malta falls. If it holds even a few weeks, the mathematics of siege warfare might shift, summer heat and disease, accomplishing what swords cannot. The first Turkish galleys enter the outer harbour, testing the range of your guns. You wait, hand on the signal flag, watching the ranging marks painted on the harbour waters, waiting for the perfect moment. When it comes, your flag drops, and St. Elmo's cannons speak as one voice, a thunder that seems to crack the morning air itself. Water fountains erupt around the lead galleys, and one, caught perfectly, simply disappears in a cloud of splinters and screaming men. First blood to the knights, but you know it's like drawing a drop from a giant who has barrels to spare. Fort St. Elmo's last hours. By June 21st, after 31 days of continuous bombardment, Fort St. Elmo had ceased to exist as a fortification and become simply a pile of rubble held together by corpses and determination. Of the original 600 defenders, perhaps 60 remained capable of holding weapons. The walls were gone, replaced by slopes of broken stone that Ottoman janissaries climbed each morning, only to be thrown back by men who fought with the desperate strength of those already dead. Brother Paolo Avogadro, one of the last knights capable of standing, left a letter smuggled to Birgu the night before the end. His words, preserved in the Order's archives, capture the apocalyptic reality. We are no longer fighting from fortifications, but from a charnel house built of our brothers' bodies. The Turks must climb over their own dead to reach us, and we meet them with swords too heavy to lift properly, armour so damaged it provides more hindrance than protection. Yet we continue, not from hope but from duty, buying with our blood each hour that strengthens Birgu's chances. The final assault began before dawn on June 23rd. Dragut himself, the legendary corsair whose tactical genius had directed the siege, had been killed by a lucky shot from St. Angelo, his death inflaming Ottoman forces to fury. They came in waves, janissaries, sipahis, religious volunteers seeking martyrdom, a human tide that simply absorbed casualties and kept advancing. The last knights formed a circle in what had been the chapel, now just a blood-soaked floor open to the sky. They died singing the Salve Regina, their voices growing fewer until silence announced Ottoman victory. But that victory had cost 9,000 Ottoman lives, nearly a quarter of their force, and consumed a month when the plan had called for 5 days. Every knight who died at St. Elmo meant dozens of Turks who wouldn't assault Birgu. The mathematics of attrition, so crucial to siege warfare, had shifted imperceptibly but decisively. Summer had fully arrived, bringing diseases that killed more effectively than cannons. Water sources were failing under the demand of 40,000 men in a landscape that barely supported 12,000. The defenders of St. Elmo, in dying, had perhaps saved Malta. La Valette's iron will. Jean Parisot de La Valette, 71 years old, veteran of Rhodes's siege 43 years earlier, commanded the defence with an iron will that seemed to physically emanate from his presence. When Ottoman engineers exploded a massive mine beneath Birgu's walls, opening a breach that should have meant defeat, Valette himself led the countercharge, an old man in full armour, fighting in the breach like a common soldier. When younger knights tried to pull him back to safety, he allegedly declared, "My life is worth no more than any other's. Here I shall die with my brothers." His leadership combined tactical brilliance with psychological mastery. When Ottoman heads were fired into Birgu by Turkish cannons, a traditional terror tactic, Valette ordered Hospitaller cannons to fire Turkish prisoners' heads back, demonstrating that brutality could be reciprocated. When food supplies dwindled to starvation levels, he publicly ate the same reduced rations as common soldiers, his visible weight loss reinforcing shared sacrifice. When proposals came to evacuate non-combatants to Sicily, he refused, understanding that defending families generated fiercer resistance than abstract duty. The most critical moment came in August, when Ottoman sappers successfully mined beneath the post of Castile, Burgu's strongest bastion. The explosion, audible across the entire archipelago, opened a breach 50 feet wide. Turkish assault troops poured through, victory seemingly minutes away. Valette, rather than ordering retreat to secondary positions, led a counterattack with the last reserves. Knights barely able to walk from wounds fighting alongside Maltese civilians, armed with agricultural tools. The fighting lasted 9 hours. Hand-to-hand combat so intense that troops became unrecognizable beneath coating of blood and dust. When darkness ended the assault, the breach remained in Christian hands, carpeted with dead from both sides piled like cordwood. Valette's greatest psychological victory came through a deception that historians still debate. In late August, he arranged for a Turkish prisoner to escape, carrying false intelligence that a relief force of 16,000 troops had landed in northern Malta. The Ottoman command, exhausted by 3 months of higher casualties than expected, facing disease and supply problems, chose to believe intelligence that confirmed their desires. When a small relief force of perhaps 600 men actually arrived from Sicily, Ottoman scouts, predisposed by the false intelligence, reported massive reinforcements. The psychological collapse was immediate and total. Ottoman forces, the finest in the world, began embarking on September 8th, abandoning equipment in their haste to escape what they believed was a trap. The miracle of September 8th, the Feast of Our Lady's Nativity, September 8th, 1565, dawned on a Malta that couldn't quite believe the Ottoman tents were empty. Scouts reported Turkish forces embarking with such haste they abandoned siege guns, worth fortunes, medical supplies, even wounded comrades. The mighty Ottoman military machine that had never failed to take a besieged position was simply leaving, defeated not by superior forces but by exhaustion, disease, and the psychological breaking point that comes when costs exceed any possible gain. Of perhaps 700 knights who began the siege, barely 250 could stand for the victory Te Deum. Malta's civilian population had suffered proportionally, with entire villages depopulated by Ottoman raids or starvation. Birgu and Senglia looked like archaeological ruins, rather than living cities, every building scarred by shot, streets cratered by explosive mines, walls more breach than barrier. Yet they had held. The order that many had written off as anachronistic had defeated the Ottoman Empire at its height, achieving something that seemed impossible when weighed by any rational military calculation. The victory's impact rippled across Europe like a stone thrown into still water. Philip II of Spain, who had provided minimal aid during the siege, now claimed credit for organising the relief force. The Pope declared a feast of thanksgiving, ordering church bells rung across Christendom. Protestant powers, despite theological opposition to military monasticism, recognised that Malta's stand had prevented Ottoman domination of the central Mediterranean, protecting even reformed territories from Islamic expansion. Donations poured in from unexpected sources. Elizabeth I of England, despite having dissolved the English lingua, secretly sent funds through Venetian banks. The transformation of the knights from desperate defenders to heroes of Christendom was immediate and absolute. Valette, who had mortgaged future revenues to fund the defence, now found creditors forgiving debts and offering new loans at favourable terms. Younger nobles across Europe sought admission to the order, seeing membership not as religious obligation but as pathway to glory. The hospital, maintained throughout the siege despite desperate conditions, became a pilgrimage destination for wealthy patients seeking both physical healing and spiritual proximity to the miraculous victory. Valletta rises from victory, From the rubble of victory rose something unprecedented in European urban planning, an entire city conceived and built according to Renaissance ideals of rational design. Valletta, named for the Grand Master, whose will had saved Malta, was laid out by Francesco Laparelli, the Pope's own military engineer, on the peninsula that had been defended so desperately. Streets followed a grid pattern that maximized defensive fields of fire while facilitating commercial traffic. Every building incorporated military considerations: flat roofs for artillery platforms, internal courtyards for last-stand defense, cisterns beneath every major structure. The construction, begun in 1566, proceeded with speed that astounded contemporary observers. Maltese limestone, carved by workers who had learned their craft repairing siege damage, rose in walls that seemed extensions of the peninsula's natural rock. The city's design balanced military necessity with Renaissance humanism. Wide boulevards that could move troops rapidly also provided public spaces for social interaction. The Colacchio, recreating Rhodes's segregated Knights' Quarter, occupied the city's highest point, but hospitals, markets, and public fountains were distributed throughout, ensuring no district lacked essential services. The auberges, rebuilt with insurance money from European properties and donations from grateful monarchs, exceeded their Rhodes predecessors in both magnificence and practicality. Each reflected its nation's architectural preferences while conforming to overall defensive requirements. The French auberge dominated through sheer scale, its facade a symphony of carved stone that proclaimed Gallic prosperity. The Castilian auberge emphasized austere functionality that somehow achieved its own severe beauty. The Italian auberge incorporated Renaissance innovations, loggias, and internal courtyards that brought light into defensive architecture. These buildings were not just residences, but statements of national identity within international brotherhood. By 1580, Valletta had become what its planners envisioned: the first planned city of the Renaissance, a living fortress that was simultaneously commercial hub, military base, hospital complex, and monastic community. Visitors described walking streets where knights in full armor passed merchants from Alexandria, where Latin prayers competed with Arabic commercial negotiations, where the wounded from naval battles were carried to hospitals that attracted medical students from Paris and Padua. The city that rose from the Great Siege's ashes had become the order's greatest achievement, proof that military monasticism could adapt to the modern world. The sovereign wealth of healing, the transformation of Malta into the Mediterranean's medical capital, occurred gradually but inevitably as the order applied centuries of accumulated knowledge to create institutions that surpassed anything in contemporary Europe. The Sacra Infermeria, begun in 1574, was designed from inception as the world's most advanced hospital. Its main ward, at 500 feet long, was Europe's longest room, capable of accommodating 900 patients in individual beds, a capacity that exceeded most European cities' entire medical facilities. The hospital's innovations went beyond scale. Every bed was enclosed by curtains, providing privacy unknown in contemporary medicine, where treatment was public spectacle. Patients ate from silver plates, not mere tradition but recognition that silver possessed antimicrobial properties they didn't understand but had observed. The pharmacy, staffed by knights who specialized in medical chemistry, produced medicines from ingredients imported globally, New World plants, unknown to Galen, Asian herbs described in Arabic texts, European traditions refined through centuries of practice. The surgical theatre, lit by massive windows and equipped with running water, permitted operations that university physicians considered impossible. Financial innovations matched medical advances. The order essentially invented medical insurance, allowing wealthy Europeans to purchase future treatment rights through substantial donations. These police holders were guaranteed care if they could reach Malta, creating a steady revenue stream that funded free treatment for the poor. The hospital treated roughly 4,000 patients annually, only a third of whom could pay, yet generated profits through auxiliary services, training physicians for fees, selling pharmaceutical preparations, licensing medical techniques to other institutions. The order's banking operations, inherited from Rhodes but perfected in Malta, made them crucial players in Mediterranean commerce. They provided letters of credit that merchants could redeem in any port where the order maintained commanderies, essentially creating an international banking network. Their reputation for absolute honesty in financial matters, rooted in religious vows, made hospitaller bills of exchange preferred currency for international trade. The treasury in Valletta held deposits from merchants who trusted warrior monks more than their own governments, generating interest income that funded both military and medical operations. Yet wealth brought temptations that challenged founding ideals. By 1600, some knights lived in luxury that mocked vows of poverty, maintaining mistresses in Valletta townhouses, gambling fortunes in unauthorized duels, treating their religious obligations as inconvenient formalities. Several Grand Masters faced internal revolts from knights who wanted to abandon the hospital mission entirely, transforming the order into a purely military force, freed from the expense of medical charity. These tensions were never fully resolved, creating a dual identity that persisted until the order's sovereign existence ended. Bonaparte's 3 days, June 9th, 1798, began like any other day in Valletta. Church bells calling knights to morning prayer, merchants opening shops in the lower city, patients in the Sacra Infermaria receiving their morning treatments. By sunset, on June 11th, 268 years of sovereignty had ended with barely a shot fired. Napoleon Bonaparte, en route to his Egyptian adventure, had accomplished in 3 days what Suleiman the Magnificent failed to achieve in 4 months. The collapse was internal before it was military. Grand Master Ferdinand von Hompesch, a weak leader elected through German financial influence rather than merit, commanded knights who had forgotten how to fight. The order that had defeated Ottoman power at its peak now included members who had never seen combat, who treated their vows as social convenience rather than sacred obligation. French knights, constituting nearly half the order, were explicitly forbidden by their vows from fighting France. When Bonaparte's fleet appeared, carrying 30,000 veterans of Italian campaigns, the mathematical impossibility of resistance was obvious to everyone except those who remembered what previous generations had achieved against similar odds. The siege was a negotiation punctuated by token resistance. French forces landed at multiple points, brushing aside militia who fled after firing single volleys. The knights, assembled in emergency chapter, voted on whether to fight, the first time in their history that resistance to invasion was debated rather than assumed. The French knights abstained, citing their inability to fight their homeland. The Spanish knights, remembering their nation's alliance with France, counselled negotiation. Only the Portuguese and Russian knights, minor contingents without significant influence, advocated resistance. Hompesch, perhaps relieved to avoid bloodshed, authorised negotiations that everyone understood meant capitulation. Bonaparte's terms were generous by contemporary standards, but devastating to institutional identity. Knights of French origin could return to France with pensions. Other nationalities could remain in Malta as private citizens or receive safe passage to any port. The order could reconstitute elsewhere, but without sovereign territory. The treasury would be confiscated but private property respected. The Maltese, who had lived under Hospitaller rule for 268 years, were promised religious freedom and local autonomy under French governance. These terms, accepted on June 12th, ended a sovereignty that had begun with papal bulls in the 12th century. The French occupation proved ephemeral, lasting only until 1800 when British forces, invited by Maltese rebels, took control, but the order never returned as sovereigns. The knights who reassembled in Rome were guests, not rulers, dependent on papal charity rather than commanding their own resources. The transformation from sovereign military power to charitable organization had begun, though it would take another century to complete. The order without a country. The 19th century was a long, dignified decline, punctuated by moments of unexpected renewal. Scattered knights attempted to maintain traditions in various European capitals, but without territory, without the hospital that justified their military mission, without enemies that required warrior monks, they seemed anachronistic even to themselves. The wealth was gone, either confiscated by Napoleon or absorbed by national governments that nationalized commanderies during the revolutionary period. What remained was essentially an aristocratic club with glorious history but no obvious future. Tsar Paul I of Russia, bizarrely, declared himself Grand Master. In 1801, despite being Orthodox rather than Catholic, married rather than celibate, and ruling a nation that had never been part of the order's traditional recruiting grounds. His assassination ended this strange chapter, but Russian knights continued operating independently until the Bolshevik Revolution, maintaining hospitals that preserved hospital and medical traditions long after the military mission vanished. These Russian facilities, particularly the St. Petersburg Hospital, introduced hospitaller techniques to Russian medicine, creating ripples that influenced Soviet military medicine over a century later. In Rome, legitimate succession continued through grandmasters who ruled from palazzos rather than fortresses, commanding knights who met for ceremonies rather than campaigns. The hospital tradition survived in attenuated form, individual knights funding medical facilities that bore the eight-pointed cross but lacked institutional connection to the order's governance. The British revived their national association, despite Protestantism, drawn by historical romance rather than religious obligation. Even America produced knights, Catholic industrialists, who saw membership as European validation for New World wealth. The papacy, recognizing the order's propaganda value even in decline, maintained its sovereign status through diplomatic fiction. The knights might not control territory, but they could issue passports, maintain diplomatic relations, and claim precedence in ceremonial functions. This ghostly sovereignty without geography, created the unique situation of a state that existed in international law, but nowhere on the ground, anticipating modern concepts of virtual nationality and deterritorialized governance. The White Cross returns. World War I provided unexpected resurrection for an order many considered historically extinct. As industrial warfare created casualties beyond any previous conflict's imagination, the knights' medical traditions suddenly seemed relevant rather than antiquated. Grandmaster Galeazzo von Thun und Hohenstein, recognizing opportunity in catastrophe, offered the order's services to all belligerents, reviving the medieval principle of medical neutrality that had characterized their hospitals since Jerusalem. Knights who hadn't worn the eight-pointed cross, except for ceremonies, found themselves in field hospitals from Flanders to Palestine. The order's organizational structure, designed for managing international military campaigns, proved remarkably applicable to coordinating medical relief across multiple fronts. French knights operated ambulance services that evacuated wounded from Verdun. Italian knights established hospitals in the Alps that treated Austrian and Italian soldiers without distinction. German knights maintained hospital trains that transported wounded from Eastern Front carnage to medical facilities in the Reich. Even the revived English Association, despite Protestant reservations, funded medical supplies for Allied forces. The most remarkable innovation was the hospital ship Carlo Alberto, flying the order's flag as a sovereign state rather than any belligerent nation. This legal fiction, accepted by all combatants, allowed the ship to enter war zones that national hospital ships couldn't access. The vessel evacuated, wounded from Gallipoli, transported prisoners of war, requiring medical treatment, and served as neutral ground for exchanging severely wounded soldiers who couldn't survive captivity. The 8-pointed cross on its funnels became one of the few symbols respected by all sides in a war that had abandoned most traditional constraints. Fra Andrew Bertie, who had become Grand Master decades later, in 1988, as the first British head of the order in its 900-year history, began his service during these years as a young volunteer. His memoirs describe the strange dignity of knights, who had seemed like historical reenactors, suddenly discovering their traditions had practical application. The hospital procedures developed in medieval Jerusalem proved remarkably effective for treating industrial warfare injuries. The organizational hierarchy that had seemed autocratic facilitated rapid decision-making in crisis conditions. The international character that had been the order's weakness during the nationalist 19th century became its strength when coordinating relief across enemy lines, from swords to stethoscopes. Listen now to the quieter rhythm of service that replaced the drumbeat of war. In the halls of the Palazzo Malta on Rome's Via Condotti, where tourists photograph the keyhole view of St. Peter's Dome, knights gather not to plan campaigns but to coordinate disaster relief that spans continents. The swords that once defended Christendom's frontiers have become symbolic, displayed in museums rather than wielded in anger. But the stethoscopes, the surgical instruments, the medicines distributed in refugee camps from Syria to South Sudan, these are real, immediate, saving lives with the same dedication that once held the walls of Rhodes and Malta. The transformation accelerated after World War II, when the Order, recognizing that military revival was impossible in the nuclear age, formally embraced purely humanitarian mission. The sovereign military order became sovereign and military in name only, its 96 member states recognizing a sovereignty that exists in international law rather than geography. Its military limited to ceremonial guards who parade in Renaissance armor during religious festivals. But this apparent diminishment liberated enormous energy for medical and humanitarian work that had always been the order's dual nature. Modern knights, 13,000 scattered across 120 national associations, include doctors who volunteer in disaster zones, business executives who fund medical facilities, lawyers who provide pro bono services for refugees. They maintain hospitals that would astonish medieval predecessors in scope while preserving traditional principles. In Rome, the Order's hospital treats anyone regardless of ability to pay, maintaining the tradition that patients are lords of the sick. In Germany, Malteser International coordinates emergency response that can deploy medical teams within hours of disasters. In Palestine, the Order operates the Holy Family Hospital in Bethlehem, providing maternity care in the city of Christ's birth, a poetic return to origins that would have pleased Blessed Gerard. Today's knights, hidden in plain sight, you pass them on streets without recognition, these modern inheritors of a tradition stretching back to the Crusades. The investment banker in London, who spends vacations operating mobile clinics in African refugee camps, the Italian countess, who manages soup kitchens in Rome that feed thousands of homeless, the American physician, who coordinates disaster response from an office decorated with maps showing hospital facilities worldwide. They wear the 8-pointed cross, not on armor but on discreet lapel pins, carry it not into battle but into boardrooms, where they negotiate pharmaceutical donations worth millions. The Order's diplomatic status, that peculiar sovereignty without territory, enables unique humanitarian interventions. Their passports, recognized by 96 nations, allow access to conflict zones where national organizations face political restrictions. Their permanent observer status at the United Nations permits advocacy for forgotten crises that lack powerful sponsors, their embassies, maintaining diplomatic relations, even with nations that don't recognize each other, facilitate medical cooperation across political divides that seem insurmountable to others. In 2013, when Syria's civil war created humanitarian catastrophe, the Order's neutrality allowed them to operate hospitals in both government and rebel territories. Knights from Lebanon coordinated supply routes that crossed front lines, negotiating safe passage with commanders who agreed on nothing except that wounded children deserved treatment. The Grand Hospitaller, a title that once commanded thousands of beds in Jerusalem and Rhodes, now coordinates global response to refugee health crises that dwarf medieval challenges in scale, if not in human suffering. The financial operations that once funded castles now support humanitarian programs, with budgets exceeding many nations' foreign aid. The Order's stamps and coins, legal tender in nations recognizing their sovereignty, generate collectors' revenues that fund medical programs. Their real estate holdings, remnants of commanderies that once controlled European provinces, provide income supporting hospitals on 6 continents. Even tourism contributes. Visitors to Malta paying entry fees to hospitaller sites that fund modern medical facilities, transforming historical curiosity into contemporary charity. Yet challenges persist that echo medieval tensions. Some members treat the Order as social club, valuing aristocratic associations over service obligations. National associations sometimes prioritize local prestige over international mission. The requirement that knights be Catholic excludes many who would serve, creating debates about whether religious identity should trump humanitarian commitment. These tensions are managed rather than resolved, continuing conversations that began when Raymond Dupuy first added swords to Blessed Gerard's bandages. The Eternal Hospital, the circle closes where it began, in Jerusalem, where the Austrian hospice, bearing the 8-pointed cross, provides medical care and pilgrim accommodation within sight of the Holy Sepulchre. The building, confiscated during World War I, returned during the British Mandate, lost again in 1948, and recovered through patient negotiation in 1988, embodies the Order's persistence through apparent defeat. Patients lying in its beds rest where hospitaller tradition began a millennium ago, though the knights treating them wear stethoscopes rather than swords. In the archives beneath St. John's Co-Cathedral in Valletta, documents spanning 9 centuries tell a story unique in human institutional memory. Parchments signed by Blessed Gerard rest near emails coordinating COVID-19 response. Battle plans for the Great Siege share shelves with protocols for treating Ebola. The rule of Raymond Dupuy, establishing obligations to serve the sick, sits beside modern corporate governance documents that would seem alien to medieval knights, yet serve identical purposes. This continuity across centuries, maintained through transformations that would have destroyed less adaptable institutions, suggests something essential about human nature's capacity for sustained service. The knights who died at Acre would recognize little in their modern successors' daily lives. No castles require defending, no Ottoman fleets threaten Christian navigation. The Muslim world that was once existential enemy now includes partner organizations coordinating humanitarian response. Yet they would immediately understand the fundamental mission, serving those who suffer, protecting those who cannot protect themselves, maintaining dignity for society's most vulnerable. The weapons have changed, but the enemy remains constant: disease, disaster, and human indifference to suffering. As darkness gathers outside your window and sleep approaches on wings of historical memory, consider this peculiar institution that refused to die when its purpose seemed extinct. The Knights of Malta, as they're commonly known despite ruling Malta for only 268 of their 900 years, remind us that human organizations can transform radically while maintaining essential identity. They evolved from hospital to military order to sovereign state to humanitarian organization, each transformation seeming to negate the previous identity, yet somehow maintaining unbroken continuity with origins. Perhaps this is why their story resonates across centuries, speaking to something deeper than historical curiosity. In an age of rapid change that makes 5-year plans seem quaint, an organization that has adapted continuously for 9 centuries, while maintaining core purpose, offers hope that human institutions can evolve without losing their souls. The 8-pointed cross that once marked crusader armor now marks medical supplies in refugee camps, transformed in meaning yet constant in its representation of service to suffering humanity. May these historical reflections have brought you comfort and calm. Rest well beneath the starlit skies of ancient nights.